The fog was thick, like a living thing, twisting around the trees as if it were trying to swallow everything in its path. At first everything seemed quiet, the kind of silence that made you nervous. But then there was the sound. A low, guttural scrape, as if something heavy was being dragged across the earth. The sound grew louder, coming from deeper within the forgotten graveyard. Amelia stepped forward, her breath caught in her chest, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the unsettling noises around her. Her eyes locked onto something in the distance, a shape barely visible through the fog. She couldn't make out what it was, but she could feel the pull, the way it beckoned her. Something was off about this place. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them, the pull stronger now, as if the very land itself were guiding her toward the truth that she wasn't prepared for. As she reached the center of the graveyard, her foot sank into the soft, wet earth, and that's when she saw it, a tombstone, but not just any tombstone. Something was buried beneath it, something that was never meant to be disturbed. Amelia's fingers brushed the cold stone, feeling its texture under her fingertips as she leaned closer. Her breath fogged up the air in front of her, but it was more than just the temperature. There was something alive about the stone, an energy that made her blood run cold. As she leaned down, a sudden shiver crawled up her spine, like fingers tracing the back of her neck. She turned her head quickly, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But there was only the thick fog and the unbroken silence of the graveyard. The weight of the air felt suffocating, as though the fog itself was pressing in on her chest. She glanced back at the tombstone, her eyes now drawn to something strange. The inscription, it wasn't right. The name was blurred, almost faded, but the date was clear, far too recent. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she stumbled back, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. She was not alone here. Something, or someone, was watching her. Amelia's heart raced as she stood up, stepping back from the tombstone. The ground beneath her felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting. She quickly glanced around, her mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? It couldn't be. The date, it was only a few years old, yet the tombstone was weathered and broken like it had been there for decades. The realization hit her with full force. Someone had been here recently. She turned to leave, her instincts screaming at her to run. But as she took the first step, a sound froze her in place. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but it came from behind her. She whipped around, breath caught in her throat, but again, there was nothing. Just the fog, heavy and still. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the hairs on her arms were standing on end, the feeling of being watched almost palpable. The silence was unbearable. Every breath Amelia took felt like a scream in the stillness. She started walking, slowly at first, then faster as the fear grew. She had to get out of the graveyard, but something was holding her there. The path out was just ahead, but it seemed to stretch further the more she walked. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling her back, anchoring her in place. The fog was so thick now that she could barely see the edges of the graveyard, and the trees seemed to close in on her. Then, just when she thought she might escape, a noise stopped her cold, a low groan, like the ground itself was in pain. The fog parted for a moment, and through the gap she saw something, someone, standing near one of the tombstones. The figure was still, motionless, but it was unmistakably human. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her legs frozen in terror. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Amelia's blood ran cold as the figure slowly shifted, its silhouette barely visible through the dense fog. For a moment, it didn't move, but then it did. The figure took one deliberate step forward, then another, its movements unnaturally slow. Amelia felt her heart pounding in her chest, the panic rising as the fog seemed to close in around her, obscuring everything except that looming figure. She couldn't run, couldn't scream. She was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away. As the figure moved closer, it raised its hand, and that's when she saw it, a glint of metal in the pale light, something sharp and glimmering. Her breath hitched. She was about to turn and flee when she heard a whisper, soft and chilling, coming from the figure. "You shouldn't have come here." Amelia stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The figure had been real. There was no mistaking it. Its presence lingered in the fog, still heavy on her skin. Her hands trembled as she wiped her face, trying to steady herself. She could still hear the whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." The words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move, as if the graveyard itself held her captive. Amelia closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to breathe. She had to leave. She had to find a way out. She forced her eyes open, glancing nervously around the graveyard. The fog had thickened further, swallowing up the path she had walked. There was no sign of the figure anymore, but that only made it worse. It was as if the fog had absorbed it, making everything feel more suffocating, more oppressive. She turned and took a hesitant step, then another. But as soon as she moved, the whisper came again, louder this time. "You can't leave." Amelia's pulse quickened, her body shaking with adrenaline. She couldn't see the figure anymore, but she could feel its presence lingering in the air, like a dark cloud hovering over her. Every corner of the graveyard seemed to be watching her, the tombstones twisted and contorted, their shapes more sinister in the fading light. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The whisper, the figure, it all felt so surreal, like she was caught in a nightmare. But she couldn't wake up. She had to get out. There had to be an exit, a way to escape this place. Her eyes darted around the graveyard, trying to spot the path she had taken earlier. The fog was so thick now that it felt like she was surrounded by a wall of mist. It seemed to close in on her with every step she took, and the air felt heavy, pressing down on her chest. Panic set in as she realized that no matter which way she turned, the fog remained thick and impenetrable. She was lost. She had been walking in circles. That's the only explanation she could come up with as she stopped, breathing heavily, her legs aching from the constant movement. The graveyard had no clear boundaries. It seemed to stretch endlessly, like an ancient maze that played with her perception of space and time. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of her footsteps was muffled by the fog. She turned again, hoping to see a break in the mist, something that would lead her out, but instead she found herself standing before the same tombstone she had passed earlier. The same cracked stone, the same weathered inscription. She was trapped. Amelia's chest tightened. It felt like the graveyard was alive, its very ground shifting beneath her feet, its tombstones moving just out of sight. The whispering started again, faint but undeniable. "You are not meant to leave." Her breath caught in her throat as she heard the words, and for the first time she realized she wasn't alone. There was something in the fog with her, and it wasn't just watching. Suddenly, the fog parted, and Amelia saw something that made her heart stop. A figure, standing among the tombstones, but this time it wasn't just a shadow. The shape was solid, humanoid, but its features were distorted, twisted. The figure was clothed in dark rags that seemed to flow like smoke, and its face was hidden in the shadows of its hood. A chill ran down Amelia's spine as the figure tilted its head slightly, its movement unnatural, as if it was not quite human. The air around the figure shimmered with an unnatural energy, and Amelia felt a sickening wave of dread crash over her. She wanted to scream, but no sound left her mouth. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to obey. The figure raised a hand slowly, pointing directly at her. A low voice echoed from the figure, cold and hollow. "You should never have disturbed what lies beneath." Amelia's legs finally obeyed, and she turned, running through the graveyard without looking back. Her breaths came in frantic gasps as she weaved between the tombstones, desperate to escape. But every time she thought she saw the edge of the graveyard, the fog seemed to pull her back, the path she was on twisting into something unrecognizable. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the eerie whispering grew louder, more frantic. "You can't escape." The words seemed to echo from all directions. Amelia's pulse thudded in her ears as she stumbled, falling to her knees in the thick mist. Her hands scrambled against the wet earth, searching for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. No path, no escape. She was lost. Her eyes darted around in panic, and then in a distance, something caught her attention. A faint light, flickering like a candle in the fog. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she made her way toward it, her only hope in this nightmare. Amelia's breath came in shallow gasps as she continued to run, her feet slipping in the soft earth, but she couldn't stop. The flickering light ahead grew brighter, drawing her like a moth to a flame. She had to reach it. As she stumbled toward the light, the air seemed to shift, becoming colder and denser. The fog wrapped tighter around her, its oppressive weight forcing her chest to tighten. Each step felt like it took longer, as if the graveyard itself was trying to stop her. The whispering voices surrounded her now, low and maddening, all of them speaking at once. "You shouldn't be here. Turn back, there is no escape." The voices merged into one haunting sound, a chorus of warnings and threats. But Amelia pressed on, her legs burning, her mind fraying under the weight of the sound. As the light grew nearer, it became clearer. It wasn't a candle. It was a figure. A woman, standing alone among the tombstones, her back turned to Amelia. The figure's presence sent a chill down Amelia's spine, and she hesitated for a moment before calling out. The woman turned slowly at the sound of Amelia's voice, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and fixed on Amelia with a chilling intensity. Amelia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman was no longer a distant figure, but standing right before her, her features now sharp and unnatural. She wore a tattered, dark dress, the fabric hanging loosely as if it were part of the fog itself. The air around her seemed to shimmer, a faint glow emanating from her that illuminated the tombstones nearby. Amelia wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but the words caught in her throat. The woman didn't say anything. She simply raised one long trembling finger and pointed to the ground at Amelia's feet. A cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine as she looked down, her eyes falling on a patch of earth that seemed different from the rest, freshly disturbed, as though something had recently been unearthed. The woman's lips barely moved as she whispered, "You found it." Amelia's gaze was drawn to the disturbed earth, the patch of ground that seemed to breathe with an unnatural pulse. The fog around her thickened, and the temperature dropped even further, making her teeth chatter. She reached down, trembling, unable to stop herself. Her fingers brushed against the cold, damp soil, and as she did, a low groan echoed from deep within the ground. Amelia jerked her hand back, her pulse racing. The woman's haunting gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering. "It calls to you," the woman whispered, her voice soft, almost soothing. "It always has." Amelia shook her head, her mind struggling to comprehend what the woman was saying. She was trying to process everything, the whispers, the figure, the overwhelming sense of dread, but nothing made sense. What is it?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though speaking louder would make the thing beneath the earth hear her. The woman did not respond with words, only a soft, almost imperceptible nod, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the thick fog. Amelia was left staring at the disturbed patch of earth, her heart hammering in her chest. Amelia's mind raced as she stood alone in the graveyard, the woman's cryptic words echoing in her head. "It calls to you. It always has." What was she talking about? What had she found? A cold wind swept through the graveyard, and the fog seemed to close in tighter around her, as though the land itself were conspiring to trap her. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. She could feel them pressing against her skin like invisible hands tugging at her, pulling her deeper into the graveyard. Her eyes darted around, but the path ahead was obscured by the dense fog. She couldn't see anything clearly, yet she could feel the pull, a force urging her forward. She glanced back at the disturbed earth, her heart pounding, and then, without thinking, she stepped closer, her foot sinking slightly into the soft soil. The whispers stopped. Silence filled the air, and the graveyard seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sudden violent shudder, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and a dark, gaping hole appeared. Something moved inside the hole, something alive, and Amelia stumbled backward in horror, the truth dawning on her. She had awakened it. Amelia's mind spun as she stumbled backward, the hole before her growing wider with each passing second. A low guttural sound rumbled from deep within the earth, like the growl of something ancient and malevolent. She wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but her body refused to move. The whispers grew louder again, mingling with the sound of the earth shifting, as if the graveyard itself were alive, breathing and waiting. She glanced back toward the path she had taken earlier, but the fog was so thick now, she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The air was suffocating, the weight of the unseen force pressing down on her chest. Amelia's eyes fixed on the hole as something dark and twisted began to emerge. It was like a shadow, a creature formed from the darkness, but its shape was impossible to define. It writhed and shifted as it came closer to the surface, its movements erratic and unnatural. Her heart raced, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. It was too late. The creature was free. Amelia's body refused to move as the dark shape emerged from the ground, its tendrils writhing in the thick fog. The creature's form twisted like smoke and shadows, its mass growing as it pulled itself free from the earth's grip. It was like nothing she had ever seen, neither entirely solid nor transparent, its body shifting with every breath it took. The whispers reached a fever pitch, now accompanied by a deep, resonating growl that echoed from the hole. It was like the very earth itself was groaning under the weight of the thing that had been buried beneath it for so long. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, every fiber of her being screaming at her to flee. But she couldn't. The creature's eyes, black as the void, locked onto her, and she felt herself rooted to the spot, paralyzed by its gaze. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, the creature let out a chilling screech that shattered the stillness, and the graveyard seemed to tremble beneath its sound. Amelia's breath hitched as the creature slowly advanced, its movements unnatural and erratic. Each step it took made the ground beneath her tremble. She wanted to scream, to run, but the terror gripping her body left her immobile. The creature's black eyes never left hers, and as it came closer, she could feel an overwhelming, suffocating force press down on her chest. It was like it was feeding off her fear, drawing strength from her terror. The air grew heavier with each passing second, the fog thickening to the point where she could barely see. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead for her life, but no words came out. The creature's twisted form swayed as it reached out, its tendrils stretching toward her, brushing against her skin like icy fingers. It whispered something in a language she couldn't understand, its voice deep and guttural, reverberating through the ground. Amelia felt the urge to collapse under the weight of its presence, but then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped, its form flickering as if it were losing its grip on reality. In that moment of frozen terror, a new sound broke through the oppressive silence, a voice. Amelia whipped her head around, almost too afraid to hope. The voice came again, louder this time, sharp and commanding. "Leave her be." Amelia blinked, trying to focus her blurry vision, and saw a figure standing in the fog, barely visible through the mist. It was a man, tall and cloaked in dark robes, his face shadowed by the hood. He stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate, as if he had no fear of the creature at all. The creature recoiled, its tendrils writhing in agitation as it hissed. The man's voice rang out again, strong and confident. "You have no claim here. Leave." The words seemed to have an effect on the creature, which let out a frustrated screech and recoiled even further, its body flickering and distorting. Amelia watched in disbelief as the man raised his hand, and the creature hesitated before retreating back into the hole from which it came. The ground closed up behind it with a low rumble, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the graveyard fell silent. Amelia collapsed to her knees, the adrenaline fading from her body, leaving her weak and exhausted. She could hardly comprehend what had just happened. The creature, the man, everything, It felt like a dream, but the terror still gripped her chest, and the fog was still pressing in, suffocating her. The man turned toward her, his face still obscured by the hood of his cloak. He took a step closer, and she instinctively flinched, expecting him to be another threat. But his voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "You are not meant to be here," he said. "This graveyard, it holds more than just the dead. There are things buried here that should never be disturbed." Amelia's throat tightened as she tried to speak, but no words came out. She could barely breathe. The man knelt beside her, his presence somehow comforting, despite the unnatural events unfolding around them. "You must leave, quickly. The graveyard is alive, and it will not let you go so easily." Amelia's mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. The man's words echoed in her mind. This graveyard is alive. The thought made her stomach churn, and the feeling of being trapped here deepened. The whispers had stopped for now, but the oppressive weight of the fog made it feel as though the graveyard was still watching her, waiting for her next move. The man helped her to her feet, his grip firm yet comforting. "You must move quickly," he urged, his voice low. "There's a way out, but it's not easy." Amelia nodded, barely able to keep her thoughts straight. She didn't know who this man was, or why he was here. But at that moment, he was the only thing standing between her and the creature that had nearly taken her life. They started walking together, the fog closing in around them once more. Amelia glanced behind her one last time, her heart racing, but the graveyard seemed quiet for now. As they walked deeper into the mist, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them, something waiting for them to slip up. The fog was thicker than ever as Amelia and the man moved deeper into the graveyard. The whispers had returned, but this time, they were different. There was something more sinister about them, as if the voices knew something they didn't. Amelia could feel the weight of their words press against her mind, suffocating her thoughts. "We're close," the man muttered, his voice low and urgent. Amelia looked at him, her heart pounding. "Close to what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the darkened graveyard, constantly wary. "A way out," he said finally. "But you need to trust me." His words hung in the air, heavy and filled with the unspoken truth that she could barely comprehend. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but at this point, he was the only one who seemed to know what was happening. Amelia glanced back at the path they'd taken, her eyes catching the faint movement of shadows in the fog. Something was following them, but she couldn't see it clearly. The graveyard was alive, and they were running out of time. Suddenly the man stopped, his hand shooting out to grip Amelia's arm, pulling her behind a large, crumbling tombstone. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the graveyard itself were trying to reach out to them. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear. There was something in the fog, something that moved with purpose, its form just beyond her vision. The man's grip tightened, and he motioned for her to stay silent. "We're not alone," he whispered urgently. "It's closer than I thought." Amelia's heart raced as she listened, the sound of footsteps in the fog drawing nearer. The tension in the air was palpable, and she could feel the cold, suffocating presence of something hunting them. Her body trembled, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking in the mist. Was it the creature from before? Or something even worse? The man turned to her, his face grim. "Don't make a sound, don't move until I say so." The footsteps grew louder, each step sending a ripple of dread through Amelia's body. She could feel the ground beneath her vibrating slightly, as if the very earth was alive and aware of the danger that was approaching. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear. She dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly. The man's grip on her arm remained firm, his body rigid as he peered into the fog. And then, the silhouette appeared, a figure emerging from the mist, tall and dark, its form barely discernible but unmistakable. Amelia's blood ran cold. The creature from earlier? No, it was different. Its body was more solid, its shape more defined. It moved with purpose, its head turning in their direction. Amelia held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give them away. The man slowly reached into his cloak, pulling out something metallic, a small, glinting object. Amelia had no idea what it was, but he was ready. Ready for whatever this thing was. The figure stopped, its form now clearer, a grotesque humanoid creature, but far more solid and terrifying than before. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human, with jagged hollow eyes, and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with sharp, pointed teeth. It sniffed the air, a low growl emanating from its throat. Amelia's heart raced and she could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. The man beside her didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. The creature took another step forward, its feet dragging through the wet ground. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. Amelia wanted to scream, to run, but she forced herself to stay silent, forced herself to remain hidden. The man shifted slightly, readying the object in his hand. Amelia couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. The man's voice was barely a whisper as he muttered under his breath. "Not yet, not yet." The creature's head snapped to the side as if sensing something had changed. The man's eyes flickered, and without warning, he lunged from behind the tombstone, throwing the metallic object at the creature. There was a flash of blinding light, followed by a deafening roar as the creature screeched in pain, recoiling from the impact. The ground trembled as if the very earth were protesting. Amelia gasped, her heart pounding as the creature writhed, its form flickering and distorting. The light from the object flickered again, brighter this time, pushing the creature back, its movements becoming erratic and wild. "Run!" the man shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Amelia didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted through the graveyard, her legs burning as she raced through the fog. The man followed closely behind her, but the creature wasn't far behind. Every step felt like the last. The whispers were louder now, but they weren't the same. The graveyard itself seemed to be alive, fighting back. And in the distance she could see it. The edge of the fog, the path that might lead her out of this nightmare. The fog thickened as Amelia and the man approached the edge of the graveyard. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was pulling them back, reluctant to let them leave. The oppressive weight of the graveyard seemed to follow them, the whispers growing louder in her mind, echoing the warnings and the threats. Amelia's legs were burning with exhaustion, but she pushed on, desperate to escape. She could see the distant trees marking the edge of the graveyard, the boundary she had longed for since the first moment she'd stepped into this cursed place. The man walked beside her, his expression grim, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "We're almost there," he muttered, barely audible over the growing whispers. But Amelia didn't feel reassured. Something was wrong. It was too quiet now, as if the graveyard was holding its breath. A sense of dread gripped her as she glanced back over her shoulder, but she couldn't see anything, only the thickening fog. It was almost as if the graveyard itself was closing in on them, keeping them trapped. Amelia's pulse quickened as they reached the edge of the graveyard, but the moment her foot stepped off the familiar ground, a strange sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a low, deep rumble, like the earth was beginning to wake. She looked at the man, her eyes wide with fear, but his face was set, resolute. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice low and urgent. Before Amelia could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, and the graveyard seemed to react, shifting like something alive. The fog curled around them, almost as if trying to pull them back into the heart of the cursed land. Amelia's heart raced, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The whispers were back, louder now, more insistent, as though they were not just voices, but a force that could reach out and drag them back. "Run," the man said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Now." Amelia didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted into the fog, her feet slipping on the damp earth. The man was right behind her, his cloak billowing in the wind as they both rushed toward the trees. The rumbling beneath their feet grew louder, and the ground seemed to shudder with every step they took. It was as if the graveyard were coming alive, its very foundation stirring with the creatures and forces that had been buried within. The whispers surrounded them, frantic and pleading, warning them that it was too late. "Keep going!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Amelia pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the fog pressed in around them. She couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to. All she knew was that she had to keep moving forward, away from the thing that had trapped her in this nightmare. With every step, the fog seemed to grow denser, but she refused to stop. Suddenly, Amelia's foot caught on something, and she stumbled, falling to the ground. She tried to push herself up, but the fog felt heavier, like it was holding her down. The man's hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her back to her feet. "Keep going," he urged again, his voice frantic. Amelia nodded, wiping the dirt from her knees, but before she could take another step, the ground cracked beneath them, sending a shockwave through the air. The rumbling was now deafening, and she could hear something massive moving beneath the surface. It was coming. They weren't going to make it. She felt the weight of that thought like a stone in her chest. But then through the thickening fog, she saw it. The trees were closer now, so close. They could make it. But only if they didn't stop. Amelia's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to run again, with everything she had, not daring to look back. With a final burst of energy, Amelia pushed herself toward the trees, the man's hand clutching hers tightly. They broke through the fog, leaving the graveyard behind, and for the first time Amelia could breathe. The air felt clearer, the weight of the land lifting from her shoulders. She turned to look back, half expecting to see the graveyard still looming in the mist. But there was nothing, no tombstones, no fog, no whispers. It was as if the graveyard had vanished entirely, leaving only the forest in its place. Amelia's heart was still pounding in her chest, her body trembling from the adrenaline, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. They had made it out. Or had they? The man stood beside her, his eyes scanning the woods around them, his expression unreadable. "It's not over," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of unspoken knowledge. "The graveyard never lets go." Amelia stood at the edge of the forest, her breath shallow and ragged as she tried to process everything that had happened. The graveyard was gone, swallowed by the mist. The man beside her was silent, his eyes scanning the woods with a strange intensity. For a moment, Amelia felt a sense of calm. The nightmares of the past hours seemed to have been a dream. But the weight in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. The man turned to her, his voice low. "We've escaped the graveyard. But that doesn't mean we're safe." Amelia swallowed hard, fear creeping back into her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the forest. "There's a darkness that follows those who disturb the land," he said grimly. "The graveyard is only one part of it. The darkness, it never lets go." Amelia's stomach dropped. She hadn't escaped at all. The very thing she thought she outran was still hunting her. The man led her deeper into the woods, his pace quick but deliberate. Amelia struggled to keep up, her legs still aching from the run. The silence around them was unsettling, as though the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. "What happens now?" Amelia asked, her voice laced with fear. The man didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the trees and shadows as if expecting something to emerge. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "Now we wait. The darkness doesn't let go that easily. It feeds on fear, on regret. And once it's latched on, it won't stop until it has what it wants." Amelia's heart sank. She had thought the worst was over, but now it felt like the real nightmare was just beginning. She looked around the trees, half expecting something to leap out at them. But the forest remained eerily still. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves, and her own quickened breathing. As they ventured deeper into the forest, a sudden chill ran through the air. The temperature dropped, and the atmosphere became even heavier. The man stopped, his eyes narrowing as he stared ahead. "It's here," he whispered. Amelia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. Something was moving, something watching them. The rustling of leaves became more pronounced. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A shape, darker than the shadows around it, moving slowly between the trees. Amelia's heart raced. It was no longer the whispers from the graveyard. This was something different, something tangible. "Stay behind me," the man said urgently, his body tense. The creature moved closer, and Amelia's pulse quickened. She was trapped once again, but this time there was no mist to conceal her, no graveyard to disappear into. This was the real terror, the thing that had been following her all along. The creature emerged from the shadows, its form twisted and grotesque, a shadow of the nightmare that had pursued them. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a cold, unnatural light. Its limbs were long and spindly, like they didn't belong to any natural creature. The man stepped forward, drawing something from his cloak, a jagged, obsidian blade that shimmered with a dark energy. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. The creature hissed, its mouth stretching open in a twisted grin. Amelia could feel the air crackle with tension as the man prepared to strike. The creature lunged, but the man was faster. He swung the blade in a wide arc, and the creature recoiled, screeching as the dark energy from the blade collided with its form. Amelia stood frozen, watching as the creature writhed and twisted in the light of the blade. It was like a battle between two forces, one of light, one of darkness, and she had no idea which one would win. The creature howled in pain as the man's blade struck true, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow more powerful, its form shifting, becoming more insubstantial. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as the creature swirled around the man, its tendrils stretching out like ghostly hands. She could see the fear in the man's eyes for the first time, a fleeting moment of doubt that sent a chill down her spine. The creature seemed to be feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing second. Amelia's instincts screamed at her to do something, anything, but her body was paralyzed. The man gripped the blade tighter, his knuckles white, and with one final desperate roar, he drove it into the creature's heart. There was a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, everything went silent. When the light faded, the creature was gone. The forest was still again. Amelia could hardly believe it. But as the man collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily, he looked up at her. "It's not over," he whispered. "It never is."